Okay. Hey guys, so we'll be starting the workshops now, but first and foremost, let's just talk about the project and workshop structure. So every Saturday, there's going to be like a 2 to 3 hour workshop. Some workshop will take a whole hour and some will be like around 15 to 30 minutes, just introducing the idea. So the rest of the project time, so like for 2 to 3 hours of Saturday, the rest of it is on working on the project. Alright? So most workshops will be introductory, and when I mean introductory, it's like a state wherein it's a workshop that connects the ideas all together in the entire like a particular topic. The reason for that is because we acknowledge that there's going to be a lot more better resources out there in the internet because it has been created or at least prepared for like many hours. So yeah, this is the workshop schedules. The first workshop that we're going to be running through is the introduction to the web development space. And then there's one incoming, like on Wednesday and the next Saturdays. So next Wednesday will be introduction to web basics. I believe Phil will be running that workshop. And then the next one's the practical software engineering practices, introduction to front-end frameworks, introduction to Vue, React, Django, TypeScript, integrating front-end and back-end, typical code-based structures, and also the package managers. And then I presume that will be by the Christmas breaks. So there's not going to be any workshops running between this one. But when we do come back, we have a couple of workshops that will run there as well. Currently, that's the workshops that are scheduled. However, we're thinking of running more workshops like after January 8th. So there's a couple of them that are currently that we think that we should be running. So if there's any particular workshop that you think that we should run, just message us on Discord or at least even just raise it on GitHub. Yep. So that's that one. Alright. So without further ado, let's start this first workshop where it's an introduction of the web development space. So this is the workshop where we navigate through the deep and dark space of web development because it's actually such a huge bit. Also, I'd like to say that we're changing the structure, or at least the presentation format of these workshops. The workshops can be accessed in a website called workshops.coderspercauses.org. So we're moving away from PowerPoint presentations. The reason for that is because we want things to be much more accessible, and when people want some certain resource, it's just in one place. Workshops.coderspercauses.org. Okay? Okay. So the content of this workshop, firstly, we're going to be talking about what and why web development, frequently asked questions in web development, the basics of the web and its limitations, so a little bit of front end, and then server-side applications. And then we're going to be talking about a couple of tools that will help you along that way. Alright? So let's start. Firstly, what is web development? Most people would think that web development is on websites development, but a lot of them actually forget that there's also another part of it, which is web application, which is dealing with client-side and server-side applications. So, but let me just clarify, what is web application in the first place? So you know websites, right? So like I go to a particular website, there's some informations. But let's move away from websites for now. Let's take a look at what's an application, you know. You're going to see like you have software that can be used for certain purposes. You have some software that are deployed in a laptop, like they call that a desktop application. And then sometimes you have software that are actually deployed on mobile apps. Then that's called a mobile applications. So web applications are kind of like a similar deal, except we deploy it over to a website. So there's a little bit of difference there, websites and web applications. Not all websites are web applications, but all web applications are websites. All right? So the next one is, now we know what is web development. Next question comes in is, why do we actually choose web development? Maybe even comparatively to other types of application development, like desktops or mobiles. So firstly, it will be the accessibility and portability. Because like, if you think about it, almost every device out there, laptops, desktop, tablets, phones, they can access a website. So if these devices can actually access the website, that means that if you can create a web application, then that will work on your phone, your laptop, or desktop. So that's actually how it's flexible. That's also the reason as to why it's something that's on demand in the market. Because like majority of the time, when companies, they look for a tool that's gonna help them, maybe a tool on the field, like, or maybe it's a tool that they also want to access like on their office. Sometimes when I'm in the field, I just want a laptop or a tablet like right here, and then collecting data or something like that. So that's an example for food bank and waste. They want an application that they can access in a tablet. But at the same time, they also want some form of application that they can also use in desktops. Yeah. There's also a huge possibility in terms of web development to combine it with other emerging technologies. Like for example, Iot Sensors. So there was one time that I actually created a sensor that's connected to a web server and it's streaming its data to a website. So that's an example. I think, let me just think of a different example with IoTs. So have you ever seen like the Arduino cloud space, wherein you can integrate a sensor and then you can take a look at what the sensor value is in just a website, like it's streaming data. That's how cool it is, because you take one portion of like a discipline, like electrical engineering, with sensors. Now you're combining it with softwares. So that's that one. There's also machine learning side, wherein now let's mix it up with data science. You have a form of data, you combine it with something, you create a machine learning model or artificial intelligence. Now you have a software that's actually using that model to actually do something about it. Maybe like for example, in the agriculture sector, you can have like a some form of data as to the current location of the plants right there. And then if you mix it up with a bit with some AIs, then using the data, like for example, the soil contents, you can create a software that actually takes a look at this data, shows it in a map, and you're going to see like how much fertilizer do I actually need to put in different places. And I think there was one company that actually does this, which is West Farmers. So yeah, very cool things. Lots of applications in different industries and lots of other disciplines that you can combine with web development. So yeah, when you take a look at the career in web development, in a 2016 survey of 50,000 developers, half of the developers are actually web developers. So as you can see here, so full stack web developers, 28%, back-end web developers, 12%. You have a couple of students over here, front-end web developers. And going back to the first one that I said, it's career. It's on demand in the job market, and as you know, like if you can develop something in terms of the web, then technically you count as a person that can develop something for desktops and also mobile. One developer for all platforms. Okay, that's web development. Next, we move on to frequently asked questions in web development. So the first question that comes up is, why do we actually code websites? Why not we just use drag and drops websites like WordPress and Wix? Has anybody thought about that idea? In this room, like, hey, why should I code websites when I can just use like maybe WordPress with Elementor? Like it's so easy. Like there's an element, paragraph, drag and drop. It looks good. Finish. Instead of you do with the HTML like, yes, I typed a little bit of HTML. Now my website looks like 1990s. But I have to use a little bit of CSS just to make it modernized. Like, it's hard, you know? So the easy answer for that one is that WordPress, Wix, and Drupal, they all have one thing in common, which is that they're all content management systems. And content management system is that they're specialized at one thing, content management. So when you go to, yeah, very hard, right? When you go to any other website right there, majority of the time, you're going to see content like for example, bloggers or news articles, they're going to be using maybe like these systems. But what about systems like, for example, the Western Australian Institute Sports app, wherein it gets a little bit complicated. Now we have a little bit of some forms, and now it communicates towards some APIs and database. Now later on, it's going to be integrated with camera sensors. So it's hard to actually even think about or actually visualize the idea of how will I even drag and drop things to make things work. But with code, let's say for example, I think you've seen it with Python, wherein you can train machine learning models right there. Like it's easier to visualize, like, yes, this function does this, but like, how about drag and drops? Like, it's hard. Alright? But there's more to that one. WordPress Wix, they all use what's called a template. If your template does not support a particular functionality, then you're going to have trouble with trying to extend it. That's the third point. Next one is cybersecurity. If you think about it, like, if it's so easy to create a website, then everybody will do it, okay? Even the non-technical personnel. But if a website is operated by non-technical personnel, that means that this is like a room of opportunities for hackers. Because like, if I think about it, a hacker discovers a vulnerability in a WordPress site. That means that all the other WordPress sites are also vulnerable. But when it comes to like your new technologies, like for example React, Vue, or Angular, there's like a variety of tech. Like a hacker discovers a vulnerability in one application, that does not necessarily mean that there's a vulnerability in another application. Okay. The next question is, what is the best way to actually learn this? So as you've seen in the content right here, like there's a lot of them. Front end, back end, there's only one bullet point over here, but there's even like deeper levels towards it. There's also different tools around it. So yeah, what's the best way to learn it? I have a short video here from Fireship that will basically explain that. Let me just see if this volume will work. So yeah, I think that kind of sums up like what's the best way to learn certain things. Because if you think about it with technologies, that it moves so fast. Like I learned something, and then there's no guarantee that in a couple of years it's still relevant. That's like, for example, when I started learning PHP like a couple of years ago, like I thought it was the most popular one, you know? Then all of a sudden, bam, there's React, Vue, and Angular. I don't know what's going on. So yeah, I think that's the best advice, because of the fact that if you study software engineering or something, you do it for the fact that because you want to create cool things. You don't go to software engineering for the sake of, hey, what's zeros and ones, and how can I, explain what a finite state machine is? No, we don't do that. We do it so that we can actually create cool things, like for example, deploy robots in the sky, takes a look at geographic maps, or even maybe make our life easier. Like for example, Google Maps, wherein we don't actually need to carry physical maps anymore. We just have it digitally over here, and it's very convenient. So yeah. And of course, when I mean by doing cool things, we probably go for trying to do personal projects, something that inspires us, something that motivates us. Maybe your dad is having a trouble in certain applications. Maybe, let me just think about an example. Maybe your dad is has a hobby of actually trying to create a lot of beautiful looking plants, and in some form of ways, he wants to be able to actually grow that in like a business or something. Like when you know software engineering, then you technically could make that as your personal project to make something cool for your dad. Like, hey dad, here's something, website where you can actually record all the plants that you're actually trying to grow, and also like nutritional contents of it, so that he can create cool looking flowers. Next one is trying to do team projects. So if you think about it, there's a lot of ways to actually learn web development. When I mean there's a lot of ways, there's also like a couple of things wherein I go to Stack Overflow and I learn the bad habits of other people, and sometimes I learn the good habits of other people. So the next point that comes in is trying to do team projects. Because if you do team projects, then you do get some sort of peer reviews. Like, for example, I'm using one variable naming, but in my reviews, this other coder says, hey, I can't read your code. Can you make this variable name a little bit much more verbose? Something like that, which is like, it's good when you're learning programming because you correct the bad practices straight away instead of you going towards an industry that says, hey, your code, it went to production, it crashed, we don't exactly know why, and this variable, we don't know what it means, something like that. Just trying to correct those silly mistakes early on in your career. Next one is watching online course. And online courses are actually quite important. I know a lot of people who say, oh yes, I don't watch online courses, I just go straight to Stack Overflow and build things. But the problem that you get when you don't try to go for online courses is that sometimes you develop what's called knowledge gaps. Like, you know how to find certain things, but like, what about some certain like direction to what's the best way to actually learn this so that I don't make a mistake before I actually learn it. So there's two things there. I make a mistake and I learn, but there's also the other wherein I did not make that mistake because I actually learned it from an online course. Somebody like made a mistake on it, but like that mistake that somebody has made, they can teach what's the best way to actually avoid it. That's that one. All right. Third frequently asked question is, why does CFC not do mobile development as much as web development? Well, there's a couple of reasons as to why is that. The first one is app stores actually have developer costs, and as a uni club, we don't actually have really a lot of funds to fund that cost. Second one is it's actually easier to deal with or teach web technologies because in some form or another, a lot of people have already used, like in some extent, HTML or CSS. Maybe they're doing WordPress development. In some extent, it's also like what I said in the beginning, which is like accessibilities. Like to develop something for the web, I just need a text editor and that's that. But for if I go with mobile development, like for example, hey, I need to set up simulators, emulators, and make sure that I've configured this correctly. Like even just that first step can be a blocker for people that are trying to learn. Next one is also the accessibility one, which is like the good thing about web development is the fact that when we try to create things, we can directly show it to other people. Like I don't need somebody to download an installer for me so that they can install it in their thing. They can just look at it like, hey man, I created something cool. Take a look at this website, and bam, they can see it. There's no extra step wherein, hey, you go to the app store, search for this thing, find it, yes, and then click. There's a lot of barriers, I would say. Okay. The next frequently asked question that I recently added here, which is like, if I already know a front-end framework, is it actually better to learn another front-end framework or to learn a back-end framework? I have a strong opinion about this one. I would say it's actually better to learn a back-end framework because you want to learn skills that will actually complement one another, not be an alternative. Because like for example, if I learn React, is it actually much more useful to learn Vue or to learn Express, for example? If I learn React and Express, then that means I can create good-looking user interfaces, but at the same time, connect this user interface to dynamic data. So something that actually, what they'll call a functional app. Instead of just, it's just a front end, nothing else. Okay? There's also reasoning around here. Is that all good for now, guys? Do you have any questions? Okay. We will continue. Okay. Let's talk about a little bit of front end. So this is what we call the basics of the web and also the limitations around it as to the reason as to why we even have front end frameworks in the first place. So firstly, we have what's called HTML, which is the Hypertext Markup Language. It kind of shows the structure of a web page. So an example would be in that image is this one. wherein, hey, I have just a couple of eyes and I have a mouth. Now, let's mix it up with it. Like, we have the structure with HTML. Then we can use CSS, which is called the cascading style sheets. It describes the presentation of a website. So, given a structure, given a content with HTML, we can position things around for those structures so that it can form something. In this example, we're forming this particular structure, the eyes and the mouth, to be at a certain position so that, and also its container, to form a circle. And now, we mix the third element of the web, which is JavaScript. This is used to program a little bit of complex feature of a web page. So it's kind of like HTML is the markup language, CSS is the making it look pretty, JavaScript is the one that makes it interactive and has logic. So in this example, we have a bunch of the circles that we said earlier from HTML and CSS. And we can make a game out of that one. So maybe like a bouncing circles, making sure that they all like, yeah, something. Okay. So the problem with HTML, well, it doesn't handle actually repeated content well. It also doesn't have variables or calculation. That's the reason why you will notice that in some places, people would say HTML is not a programming language. And that is true because it doesn't handle those stuff. CSS, on the other hand, well, the problem with CSS is the fact that you actually have to deal with a lot of, I guess, manual coding in some extent. Like, hey, I have a content, I want it to become a circle. But sometimes you just want to say, hey, I have a content, I just want things to look pretty, you know? I don't want to have to go to like say, hey, when I hover on certain things, it has to go on a different color or something. And if I hold it, then it has like a yeah, I would say like active element, but I don't have an active element over there at the moment. So yeah, so HTML, as I said, there's no repeated content, and that will go later on JavaScript. CSS, well, the reason why we have CSS frameworks, on the other hand, is for the fact that sometimes we just want things to like look like a button, for example. Like we have frameworks like Material UI or Bootstrap that says, hey, this is a button, make it look like a button. Okay? JavaScript, it has the capability to modify your user interface, HTML structure, but it does become really tedious. And you will learn this more about in the workshops to come. HTML syntax looks like that. CSS looks like that. And JavaScript looks like that. Okay? Okay. So now let's move on to modern frameworks. So we've discussed a little bit of the limitations of HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So let's dig deeper with websites. Websites can actually be much more. They can be web applications. And we've discussed about that one at the beginning, wherein we have websites that's just presentation and content. We can make that better such that it's now much more interactive, something that you can use for much more complex cases. So applications, they're like your apps in the web. Okay? The two most popular frameworks out there are React and Vue. So React is actually more mature and is actually used for more in the industry. So we're going to see a lot of job applications right there that's going to say, hey, prepared qualification, you know React and has built a project with it. But, so React was built by Facebook. Vue is built by Evan You, so one of the open source maintainers out there, and is one of he's a big figure in the open source community. So in terms of choosing whether to learn React and Vue, well, both are actually good to use and also learn. I've heard a lot of developers say, yes, Vue is actually easier to learn. And I've heard some similar things with React as well. So both are good to learn. And second point is knowledge is actually transferable between the frameworks. Like you're going to see that if I built something in React, like you're going to immediately see that there's equivalence in Vue. Okay? So now let's move on to server-side applications and backend. So, but firstly, let's introduce the idea of how do devices actually communicate. So I have a browser, and it's trying to get some data over to another place. So it kind of looks like this, wherein this is my devices. It connects to the internet, and it connects to the server, or server application. Then it's connected to a database. So this path or transfer is usually done in what's called the Hypertext transfer protocol, which is by HTTP. So going back, front ends, they're usually the ones that you can interact with. So it describes the look and feel of your websites or application. But the backend, a lot of people will ask, then what do backend actually does? Firstly, they can be the place or application that serves front-end materials. So they're like the source of, if I'm at the browser, I go to a certain place, this server application actually serves me contents like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then going back to my thing. So that's one application. The second one is what's called a web application programming user interface. The easiest way to explain an application programming interface is by an analogy. If I have a user interface, then who interacts with that interface? Anybody?
The user.
Exactly, the user. If I have an application programming interface, then what interacts with that interface?
The application.
Exactly, the application. Oh man, that's time enough, guys. I know the pizza hits really hard. Yeah. So if I have my browser, it has HTML, CSS content, and I want certain types of data, then this type of application is what's called a client-side application. A client-side application then gets data from a server-side application. That's the reason why the server-side application is majority of the time called the application programming interface. So yeah, it serves data, usually from a database, but at the same time, it can also do processing of requests. Like for example, sending emails, or even sending SMS, or even doing machine learning. All right, that's server-side application. Database, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It's a place to actually store the data. There's really two main parts of a database, or at least classification. You're going to have the NoSQL database. An example of that is MongoDB, which allows for database design to be modified without actually complex migration or even data loss. Next one is SQL, which is called the structured query language. It's typically faster and also better for large amounts of data systems. However, it really requires it enforces structure in its schema. So when you try to handle for example, sensor data is an example of I don't know what other data there could be. Maybe temperature, humidity, so that would work perfectly with NoSQL database. But if I have, let's say, for example, transactional data that says hey, this transaction will always be, there's a from, to, and also time. And that works better with SQL. Okay. I think we've discussed majority of this now. There's only a couple of things left to go to, which is the others. Firstly, the languages of the web. So the usual, we have Python. And within Python, there's two main web frameworks that's being used, which is Django. That's one of the technologies that's actually being used in the Waste project. There's also Flask. Flask, you will touch that if you do SITS 3403, which is Agile Web Development. Next one is JavaScript. JavaScript is the language of the web. you're going to see it in a lot of places. Like for example, with front end like React and Angular and Vue, that's using JavaScript. You can also see it actually in back end systems, wherein we have Node.js and Express. There's also a couple of ones like Ruby, Go, Rust, and C. In terms of hosting, there's actually a lot of ways to do hosting. You could own a server, or you could even use a third-party platform. An example of owning a server, like for example, I have a Raspberry Pi, which is like, I deploy this towards a network, and then I run the applications towards this Raspberry Pi, and then I set up a bunch of port forwarding systems to actually have a website being served from a device that I own. Next one is the third-party platforms. I think you've heard of AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, or even like Vercel or Heroku. So those are places where you don't own the hardwares, but you can host your applications somewhere. So just somewhere in the internet, which they call the cloud, big black box. Next one is the CSS frameworks. So the CSS frameworks, actually, I would say this one is the front-end frameworks, not the CSS frameworks. A little bit of typo there. You have the Vue and React, Nox and Next.js. Nox is for Vue, Next.js is for React. And then you have this one, the CSS frameworks. The CSS frameworks helps you in trying to develop good-looking applications without having to put in the effort of trying to go through a lot of CSS. You will find that out later in the project if you haven't dealt with CSS. It's one of the most annoying technologies that you will find, but if you learn it really well, and at the same time you mix it up with, like for example, Material UI, then you're going to have a great time in terms of, hey, look at me. I just put in a couple of codes right here and take a look at this good-looking website. Yep. Next, the developer tools. We have TypeScript, which is currently being used in the Food project. So what it does is that it, as you know, if you've dealt with JavaScript, I'm just being mindful that some people are beginners. With JavaScript, it kind of looks like this. You don't deal with anything related to, hey, this variable is an integer, this variable is a string. You don't deal with that in JavaScript. So what TypeScript does is that it just adds typing, so that it's useful for, it helps you in an extent wherein you get your code editor, like for example VS Code, suggesting that there's going to be a mistake that's going to happen here, like for example, you declared a variable to be an integer, but then you're assigning it as a value as a string. It's going to have like a panic attack. There's a problem here. Solve it. Yeah, we're gonna have a workshop for TypeScript later on in the project, so just be aware. Next one is testing. We're going to have another workshop for testing as well, but just to introduce you, there's a couple of tools out there, which is Selenium and Cypress, used for end-to-end and automated testing tools. End-to-end automated testing tools are kind of like, they mimic the action of a human, like for example, keyboard clicking, mouse clicks, and so on. We also have unit testings, Jest, Mocha, and PyTest. And yeah, testing is vital to any software project, and you'll find that out later on. We're also going to be dealing with continuous integration and also continuous deployment. So the idea of trying to make sure that we have our software and it's always getting tested automatically at every change is going to be there. So there are event-driven scripts. You have examples there, GitHub Actions and Bitbucket pipelines. So if you're curious, you can just search these keywords and it'll give you that. Next tool is Virtualization and Containerization. So it allows execution of services in what's called a virtual environment. An example would that be is with the Waste project, if we're dealing with that one, is that we have all sorts of services, front-end APIs, database, mock services that are getting run with just one command, which is called docker compose up. You'll find that out later. And here's the example, Docker and Vagrant. Next one, your tools are the browsers. You have your standard browsers, Google Chrome, Firefox, and Edge. And something to note, or at least be aware of in terms of the web, is trying to make sure that your code is backwards compatible. And when I mean backwards compatible, as the technology evolved, like JavaScript also evolves to the point that all browsers actually does not support newer syntax of JavaScript, which means that if you deploy a website, it may not necessarily work for many versions years ago in Internet Explorer. That's an example. Something to be aware of is mobile and screen readers. Screen readers for accessibility. You're going to see that later on, where you're going to have like an ARIA properties to be aware. Mobile is also a very good thing to be aware of, is that screen sizes look very differently for laptops and also phones, which means that if you're developing website, majority of the time, you want to develop one user interface, or even a code that will actually create two user interface depending on which device you're at. Next one, Firebox developer tools. So you're going to have like page inspectors, grid layouts, and also being able to visualize certain things in the element. You'll see that if you just press F12 or even just do it like that, like this. Yeah, I don't know why that opened that. There's a lot more in terms of the tools you have there, if you're curious. Next one is package managers. So package managers are tools that use for installing libraries. Later on, we have a workshop for that one that talks about how you can use it so that you can use the code of the open source community. Because the good thing about knowing package managers is that if you want to implement certain things, like for example, I want to create an application that deals with displaying maps, then there's like hundreds of libraries already that done that. It's just a matter of installing it and using it. Now here we go, a couple of lines of code, we have a map. There's going to be version control systems. So in the Waze project and also Food Bank, all of those codes are stored in GitHub, which is managing the versions of the software. So that at any given moment of time, let's say for example you introduce a bug at one time, you can go back in time to actually go back to a portion where the code was working. That's an example application of version control. Next one is linters and formatters. We're almost there at the end. So linters and formatters are used for code formatting and making sure that they follow a particular standard. The reason why this one is one of the most important developer tools is because, have you ever dealt with a project wherein a developer just randomly put space or tabs at certain places, or even just change the quotes to double quotes? That's an example. If you deal with code review systems, you're going to see that whenever there's a change, there's going to be reds and greens. And you don't want a project wherein you just have a developer that just, put so many spaces out here that's not really a real change. Instead, you just see a bunch of Christmas lights of reds and greens in your code reviews, and bam, it's hard to read. Next is Teamworks. So there's many tools out there. It's used to stop teams from actually stepping each other's toes. There's also another workshop for that one. It's called the Software Engineering Practices, which deals with GitHub issues and also pull requests. Okay. This is just the list that we currently have, but I think the open source community is actually maintaining a learning roadmap for all the developers. So you have front-end developers materials over here. If you're interested, check it out over here. But yeah, we're not going to be discussing here. Oh man, that's a very mouthful workshop. Lots of contents to go through. So I guess to finalize this workshop, there's a lot of things to learn, and I know in some extent that it's a little bit of it's discouraging because like take a look at all these things I need to learn just to even be able to get things done. Going back to one of the frequently asked questions, which is about what's the best way to actually learn this? Well, you learn this on the go. You want to create a project that values you, that you value, and then you go from there. Like maybe in some extent there's going to be a tool you're going to say, hey, maybe I should learn this tool because it's going to make it easier for me to actually develop the things that I want to develop. You know, so I just tell you my story and how I started in terms of web development. So I started actually hating web development. Like I started it when back in high school. I'm trying to create like websites. You know, it's a little bit of discouraging because of the fact that hey, I create a page in HTML and then I show it to quite a lot of people and they think yeah it's boring. You know, like it sucks. And you know, there's a little bit of an up and down journey because like high school, things aren't a little bit in a space wherein it's encouraging. So I grew up hating web development, to be honest. Even though currently I work as a senior developer at Lottery West, where I do full stack web application. So that's the main thing. The point that it actually changed is when I got involved with the Coders for Causes when I was a first-year student. They said, hey, the reason why you're hating web development is because you're not pointed at the right direction. So the reason why I'm telling you a little bit of this story is because on a personal level, like I feel like everyone in this room can actually do things. Like I've seen a lot of people wherein they say, hey, I'm not going to touch web development because I can't create good-looking website. But you know, people are not born with the skills. Skills are honed because they work hard and basically they put in the time and effort to go through all sorts of workshops or even online courses out there, and they try their best to actually create something. They just need a little bit of guidance. So yeah, that's for me, and I would say if at any given moment of time you feel like you're giving up, probably talk to another person in this group. They're probably feeling the same way as you, trying to learn all sorts of things, trying to juggle uni and also work and even just extracurricular like this. So yeah, okay.